Hello, on Tuesday, January the 24th, just want to report a few thoughts on the current state of our economy and kind of background or context from which we perhaps ought to start rethinking some things. As for most of us, economic issues center on whether we have a source of income that provides enough funds to purchase what we need and want. During the pandemic we faced and perhaps got used to, wondering whether what we need or want is even available. From supply chain issues to lockdowns to an inability to effectively address what had become a worldwide system of trade and manufacturing, the pandemic brought to our attention issues to which most of us pay no attention on a day to day basis. As political and economic leaders seek to cast blame and promise to extract from the problems or extract us from the problems that they created, now might be a time for a discussion about the nature of our economic systems and what might be expected of our business and economic leaders. At what point did our leaders decide that economic management can be divorced from material constraints? During the Middle Ages, alchemists sought to generate what people wanted in the context of their ignorance of the basic material framework of our physical existence. Given their lack of understanding of the material world, a lack which their efforts indirectly helped to overcome, thinkers and searchers in the Middle Ages might be excused for doing what they could to effect changes which went against the basic structure of our material world. Insofar as certain economic principles have been in place since long before economics was even a science, what excuse do we offer for politicians and economic arguments which ignore the basic structures of economic reality today? Politicians on both sides of the aisle have demonstrated a willingness to abandon economic principles to achieve short-term economic and political gain. Conservatives operate as if the economic conditions of the 21st century are no different than those in the 18th century, while some liberals have latched onto the promise of modern monetary theory, MMT, as the fountain of funds to facilitate fiscal wish fulfillment independent of financial laws. But MMT presents itself as a theory based on how governments, particularly the US, have functioned in recent decades. It is not a proven alternative to traditional fiscal policy making based on, or operated irrespective of, basic economic premises which have developed over the millennia of human existence. Proponents of MMT, as I understand it, argue that the federal government, as the ultimate authority for determining monetary policy and the availability of funds and the relative value of those funds in the market, is free to print money to fund any policy it wants so long as inflation does not get out of hand. MMT as active fiscal policy has been operating on steroids in the US for the last few years. After spending the previous few decades testing the waters to see if there would be any pushback, politicians from both parties abandoned any sense of limits to fiscal spending. Post-World War II spending has been based on political wish lists rather than political agreement as to what the government should do, over against the funds available to get said functions done. As political parties learn to manipulate the spending processes involving budgets, entitlement programs, and extra budgetary spending agreements, the will to limit expenditures to receipts seemingly has been eroded to the point of no return. No longer do we hear of kicking the can down the road, as there is no down the road with which modern political calculations are concerned. The issue is political expediency in the name of causes, however justified, which will best serve the powers that be. It is no longer a matter of making choices between expenditures. Rather, it is a matter of expending all one can while one is in power. Each party uses the other party's failure to consider the consequences as justification for their own open-ended spending policies. As a result, we now authorize multi-trillion-dollar programs which result in multi-billion-dollar fraud and waste across the political spectrum. What nation can long survive perpetual fiscal mismanagement? We have convinced ourselves that we can have everything we want, let alone everything we need, and have spent accordingly. Occasionally there has been pushback, but spending beyond our means is as American as apple pie. When the Tea Party movement was the face of fiscally conservative policy back in the 1980s, a representative made the news for stating from the House floor that seniors should not be forced to decide between buying medicine and buying food. That sentiment has been echoed many times since, but that is a false claim made in the context of nearly a century of unprecedented material prosperity, in which both food and medicine are more available than any time in human history. The material world is finite. Life is a matter of choosing between options. The choices that we make today lay the foundation for the choices that will have to be made tomorrow and in generations to come. Attempting to skirt making these choices, often very difficult choices, has brought us to the brink of economic and social collapse rather than a utopian paradise where everyone's needs and wants are fulfilled. A simple working definition for an economy is the exchange of goods and services. At its core, an economy is a framework in which people can exchange what they have for what they need or want. There may be many different ways to actually organize and manage that exchange, but having something to exchange and having an agreed upon framework in which exchanges can take place are central to an economy. Economies have developed over time with the same basic goal for all involved: survival. The lone individual or family in the wilderness is not involved in an economy. They either find or make what they need to survive, or they do not survive. A wandering clan of hunter-gatherers may have some version of an economy within its organization. Someone collects the edible seed while someone else kills the deer, and someone else catches the fish, and someone else cooks it all into a stew they can share to live another day. Membership in the group, even the size of the group, is dependent on what one contributes to the success, which is to say survival, of the group. As clans became more successful in securing certain necessities and less inclined to destroy each other on sight, there was an opportunity to develop an exchange or barter economy whereby groups mutually benefited from the success and abilities of other groups. Over time, more complex economies developed. Still, the primary basis for economic development centered on securing what was necessary for survival, for needs, and then wants. As groups agreed on the value of certain materials as a medium for exchange, one can move beyond a system of bartering to a system in which the value of a third item, such as conch shells or beads, served to facilitate the exchange of goods and services independent of the items or parties involved in the transaction. When King Croesus established a system of gold coinage, technically electrum, gold and silver combined, a medium of exchange was established which facilitated economic activity across space and time with no necessary relationship between either the traders or the items being traded. Gold has always been, and presumably always will be, recognized as valuable in its own right. When the U.S. abandoned the gold standard in the 1970s, the door was open to depending on the good faith and credit of the issuing nation for the value of the nation's currency. For at least a while longer, the U.S. dollar is a recognized reserve currency on the world market. The position of the US dollar is not because of any inherent value to the paper or ink from which a dollar is fashioned, or to a fixed value item such as gold to which the volume of dollars is tied, but because it is backed by the historic stability of the US government and the economic and social systems to which said government is related. Over the last few years, however, there has been a growing challenge to the position of the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. The challenge, primarily from China in league with other BRIC nations, is growing more credible, not just because of the increased economic, political, and military clout of China on the world stage, but because of recent actions taken by the U.S. with respect to fiscal and other issues in international affairs. Questionable economic actions within the U.S. economy have further eroded trust in the position of the U.S. dollar. Economics as a discipline is an increasingly complicated enterprise with both thinkers and economic manipulators pushing the boundaries of what an economy can sustain. On the one hand, most of us are unaware of the multitude of factors that go into sustaining an economy and the justifications offered for any given economic system. On the other hand, most of us are generally aware of the broad approaches to economic theory, such as capitalism and socialism. Theory and the real world, however, do not always sync when human beings are involved. Even as market researchers and psychologists demonstrate an uncanny ability to more effectively target marketing pitches to our individual wants and idiosyncrasies based on past actions, there will always be, I believe, an aspect of indeterminism in the human psyche, which means we do not always act as we presumably ought to act. Dealing with human beings involves an element of risk that may jeopardize one's own hopes and aspirations. One of the most consistent characteristics of human beings, however, is their willingness to pursue what they believe is in their own interest, irrespective of what that pursuit might mean for others. Perhaps that is to be expected in a world of seemingly limitless potential, but with finite resources at any given moment. Maybe we have hope for tomorrow, or maybe not. Either way, if we do not survive today, tomorrow will not be an issue. Effectively meeting today's needs while preparing for tomorrow is critical to success in life, whether we are speaking of individuals, communities, or nations. Maybe the US and the world have peaked in terms of economic prosperity for the largest number of people possible. Maybe we have reached a point where more progress is still possible if we learn to reflect critically on what we know about human behavior and how we might more effectively maximize both economic opportunity and success in a way that keeps the door truly open for all. If history is any indicator, perpetuating the myth of unlimited material prosperity and economic utopia for all, without any concern for the real economic and material issues facing us today, opens the door to disaster for all. When the evidence continues to suggest that not all are sharing judiciously in the increased material prosperity of the modern economy, we would do well to consider the basis for said disparity and its justification, and how we might seek to adjudicate this disparity. As a nation, we need a serious review of what we are doing and why we are doing it to ensure that we can truly afford the cost. As all lifeguards know, you must save yourself before you can save anyone else. We must abandon the false economic promise of prosperity for all at a cost to no one. Enough of the economic alchemy. We need an economic system that provides everyone with financial hope and opportunity both today and into the future, based not on empty promises, but on policies that reflect what is, in fact, materially possible.